Thank you, and thank you all for joining us again for this really fantastic series. I hope that you are learning a lot and getting a lot out of this. Education is the top priority of our city, our community, our Nashville Chamber of Commerce, our mayor, and so it is a timely topic. And so today you have a special treat. You're really going to dig into the data and the research around student performance. And you're going to have an opportunity after that presentation to ask questions about it. Now, during the presentation, if there is a question of clarification, if something's not clear, Paul has said that he would be absolutely willing to recognize you and clarify that. But if you have a more substantive question, let's save that to the end and get through the PowerPoint, and then we'll get to that point. So my name again is Mark Hill. I'm with the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. And I have known Dr. Paul Changus for a long time. And I first knew him in the 1990s by reputation. When I was working for the Tennessee General Assembly, Dr. Changus was at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. At that time, the state of Tennessee contracted with UT to do all the state testing in K through 12. And Dr. Changus was part of that team back then. He was stolen away from UT and the state by Metro Schools in 1998, where he came to the district and is really one of the premier state experts on testing and accountability. His official title is Executive Director for Research and Accountability. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Changus.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about testing issues in general, the good and bad. There are sometimes unintended consequences with the tests we give. It's hard to pick up a newspaper these days without something related to accountability with regard to assessment not being on, on the front page or somewhere in that paper. There are a lot of high stakes to testing. I've been working with tests since the mid-1970s. My background was in testing and measurement. I helped develop some of the tests that have evolved in Tennessee over the years. I worked in a lab where we were doing computerized adaptive testing, developing methods on tests that were adapted to the individual based on how they performed on previous questions. And at that time, I never dreamed that we would put the kinds of stakes on tests that we do today. And I'm going to talk just for a few minutes today a little bit about that evolution, and then talk about the tests that we give in Tennessee. This is your time, so if you do need clarification as I go, feel free to ask questions, and then, as Mark said, we should have plenty of time at the end to go into more depth. These two gentlemen are kind of pioneers in the testing and measurement movement in this country. Testing goes all the way back to many centuries to China when it was used to help identify government workers. But in the Western world, we tended to stay away from multiple choice testing, from asking a lot of questions. We were more into the Socratic approach and essays and oral testing until the Industrial Revolution. And the gentleman on the right, Lewis Terman, developed the first IQ test in this country back in 1916. He was born in Indiana, went to Stanford University in 1910, and he developed a lot of the methods that are still in use today with the way we test intelligence. And it was the first large-scale testing evolved out of that. L.L. Thurstone was actually an engineer, worked briefly under Thomas Edison at one point, but developed a lot of the statistical methods that are in use today, what factor analysis methods that are in use and involved in a lot of the testing we do and development of scales. Thurstone also believed that there wasn't just one general intelligence factor, which we refer to as IQ, but that there are a lot of multiple factors. He identified 7 independent factors that he thought were important in IQ. And one of the reasons I'm starting with them, this book that I have on probability, Fundamentals of Statistics, 1925, L.L. Thurstone. A co-worker of mine, when she retired from Metro Schools several years ago, gave me this book. It's by Thurstone. It was donated by Dr. Terman to the Vanderbilt and Scarrett libraries back in the 1920s from his library. It's actually signed in here by Professor Terman. And I guess over the years they decided, well, it's an old book, we don't need it, and they tossed it in the free book section. So I have I don't know if it's a collector's item, but I have a book that to me is quite interesting, because we're talking about the man who developed the term IQ, Dr. Terman. And when I say there are unintended consequences in the way we use tests, first of all, the IQ test became a staple in the military in World War I. It was used to identify potential officers and to categorize recruits in the Army in terms of their background and where they should serve. But then it became kind of a vehicle for other movements, including the eugenics movement in this country, unfortunately, the belief that we could identify this single component that was predictive of future success, and people started trying to connect it to race and background. It factored into to our policies on immigration in the 1920s and 30s. And you would think that brilliant men like this would realize that administering a test to someone who didn't speak a particular language, such as the English, which the tests were administered in, or who had no formal education, might be at a disadvantage when they took those tests. But somehow that eluded them, and 85% of Russian immigrants were identified as, the technical term was moron. They were over standard deviation below the normal IQ. My family fortunately immigrated from Southern Europe, from Greece, a few years before that movement started, and we were able to get in even though English was not our strong point. But it just shows you that there are potential positive uses and negative uses or abuses with these tests. And that is something that has continued to this day to some degree. When I was going through graduate school in the 70s, we were told that validity of a test was a component of the test itself, that it was a product of that test. And it's not the test itself, it's how we use the test. You can use a test in a valid way, or you can use it in an invalid way. When we started testing American Indians, Native Americans who in the Southwest who were not native English speakers, and started putting them in classes for exceptional education or mentally disabled students because of those test scores, that was an improper use that continued for many decades. Now, we're not quite as blatant these days with our testing, but out of that IQ movement, we started developing college entrance exams in the 1920s and 30s. That the Ivy League schools decided that they wanted to measure this intelligence component that students have and start identifying some potential recruits to their universities who may not have had the formal education and background that some of their prep school students had. They wanted to identify students who maybe came from disadvantaged situations. So there was some positive benefit out of that. Now we test over 100 million Americans a year with various tests, and it's moved more from the aptitude or IQ testing movement to what we call the achievement movement, and particularly a standards-based assessment movement, which I'm going to talk about, and that's where we are with regard to accountability in this country, and we'll talk about that. Very basic question. I'm going to ask a few very basic questions. What is a test? We've all administered tests at some point or taken tests. And all it is a sample of behavior. There are informal tests that classroom teachers give every day. When you're asking a student a question about something they've read or giving them a little pop quiz, that's a teacher-made assessment that's a very important part of the assessment process. We tend to think about more formal or standardized testing as a test, but all of these are an assessment of student behavior to try to determine what the skills, knowledge, underlying capacity of that student is. And we are very focused on the high stakes test these days. So why do we test? A classroom teacher has a different purpose. During the course of the year, they want to know where there are gaps in a student's knowledge or achievement that they can address immediately. We've, as a school district, give what we call formative assessments, tests that are ongoing through the year that are more formal than the classroom teacher test, but that help us determine if students are progressing as we would like. Some of those are predictive tests to tell us if we're on track to hitting our goals at the end of the year on the high stakes tests. Accountability, we know, is not going away in this country. While educators can complain about funding issues, the reality is that a lot of our tax dollars go into education, and schools and teachers are accountable. And right now, teachers are accountable like they've never been before in this state. And we'll talk more about that. The main assessment program in this state is the TCAP assessment program, and I actually have given you a handout that talks about some of the key assessments. But it's not just one test, it's a program, Tennessee Comprehensive Assessment Program. It started in this state back in 1990. I was at the state at that time, and it was a tremendous change from the amount of testing that we did. We weren't testing students every year, like at every grade level like we are now, beginning in grade 3, prior to that time. But there's a TCAP achievement test, which our elementary and middle school students take in reading, language, math, and science. When I talk about unintended consequences, we're going to talk more about NCLB. One of the unintended consequences of NCLB is that we have focused on reading and mathematics. Those are the two subjects that we're accountable for. Now that doesn't mean science and social studies, the arts, music aren't important, but when you're evaluating individuals, and particularly administrators, based on certain subject areas, it has an impact on behavior, including the amount of time we spend on those two subject areas. And we know reading and math are critical areas, but sometimes it's a fight with some of our schools to make sure that we're not shortchanging other areas. We give EndofCourse exams in several subjects at the high school level. The nice thing about these tests is they are aligned to our state standards. They are a measure of achievement of Tennessee skills and standards. That wasn't the case prior to, completely the case prior to NCLB, No Child Left Behind, the federal mandate that came about 7 or 8 years ago. We were giving nationally normed tests as a critical part of our accountability piece. And in other words, teachers and schools were being held accountable for a test that overlapped with our curriculum, but maybe only 50 or 60% of the curriculum was on that test. And we were testing students on other things. So now we do have alignment, which I do believe is important. Most of these, yes?
Clarification. You say that the TCAP is aligned to state standards?
Yes.
But not to national standards?
Well, it's aligned to state standards. I will tell you that over the last decade, there's been a tremendous movement toward states aligning to national standards. So while they're specific to Tennessee, national assessments are very comparable. And I'm actually going to talk in just a minute a little bit more about that. Because there's only one true national test, what we call the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And it's not a high-stakes test for our students. It's given every couple of years in this country in selected grades and subjects, but the results are only reported at the state level. Not at the school level, not at the classroom level, not at the student level. But it's kind of the U.S. Department of Education's scorecard on how states are doing. And I'll talk in just 1 minute a little more about that. I do want to mention that in Tennessee, most of the testing we've been doing in recent years has been multiple choice. One exception to that was the TCAP writing assessment, which is a prompt that's given at 3 grades. Those grades have changed a little bit over time, but it's currently grades 5, 8, and 11. And students respond to that with an essay. And I was at the State Department in the mid-90s when we gave the first writing assessment. And the results were so bad, the Commissioner of Education didn't even want to release those results. Our feeling was we need to know that our students are not very good at writing. we're not going to get better until that happens. And there was a little bit of an internal fight, but the results were released, and scores in this state have gone up dramatically on the writing assessment because, you know, what's measured is taught, and there has been an effort to improve writing instruction. We're excited that, yes?
Excuse me, I know what holistic medicine is, but I don't know what holistic scoring is. Could you give us a definition of
Yeah,
that?
holistic scoring is basically looking at the essay and does it communicate the message. It is, you know, it's not worrying so much about spelling or punctuation or even in some cases, well, it's more about the communication piece. Now, if it's so poorly written that you can't even read it, then those things become important. But it's basically a quick read and what's your overall impression on a 1 to 6 scale, with one being a pretty poor report, 6 being something that's truly outstanding. Our goal is to be at a competent level, which is a 4.
Who evaluated these writing tests, and do I understand that they were evaluated on a 1 to 6 score?
It is a 1 to 6 scale. They're external readers. They're not scored by Tennessee teachers. The state contracts with a company, and they bring in many cases, retired teachers or part-time educators who are involved and trained to read those and to score those. We do our own district writing assessments. When you're doing something like this that could be fairly subjective, there's a lot of training that goes into it. We also have occasional checks where we give what we call an anchor paper that we have previously scored by consensus and administer that to different individuals and who are scorers. And if they're off track and they're scoring, additional training is required for those individuals. But they are scored externally. So we test for a lot of reasons, but the bottom line is that the money that's coming to for these tests is for the purpose of high stakes accountability, to hold schools accountable. And TCAP is that main vehicle. 2 years ago, the standards in Tennessee changed dramatically. The governor went across the state to announce this. The commissioner of education went across the state. You're going to see in a second how far they changed because it was quite dramatic. Tennessee, prior to 2010, had some of the lowest performance standards in the country. It's not that our curriculum was that different, but our expectation of student performance was dramatically different. This graph, the dark blue bars are this National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is 4th grade reading. And it has 4 levels, with advanced obviously being the highest, below basic the lowest. That's the percent of Tennessee students in the 4th grade that fell into each category. So you see, when you add the 37 and 35, you see 72% of Tennessee 4th graders were below proficiency according to this national assessment, which is given to a sample of Tennessee students across the state. But meanwhile, we give a TCAP achievement test that had 3 criteria: proficient, advanced, and what we called below proficiency at that time. You see pretty dramatic differences in the results. We were saying that 89% of our students were proficient because of where we set the bar in Tennessee. And let me note that when the standards for Tennessee were set, they were set by Tennessee educators, including superintendents and administrators as well as teachers, who knew that they were going to be held accountable under No Child Left Behind, with an eventual goal that 100% of all students would be proficient or advanced. When you're being held accountable for a test and you're setting standards, there's a little conflict of interest. And you can see that there was a huge gap. The Department of Education, when this data became public, talked about truth in advertising. And they made dramatic changes that occurred in 2010. And you see the results from the 2010 TCAP, which now has, this is the achievement test given in grades 3 through 8, but this is specifically 4th grade. You see 4th grade reading scores in 2010 on the TCAP were dramatically different. The bar on the right, kind of brown in color. now, instead of having 89% of our students proficient or advanced, we had 42% statewide. As someone who's been working in the state of Tennessee and has been at the Department of Education, has been in a school system, I was shocked that the state went this far from the second easiest to what are considered now the second most rigorous standards in the country, only behind Massachusetts. It was a tough step to take because we knew that when these results came out, it was going to get a lot of attention, and educators were going to be in the middle of this storm in terms of not preparing students well enough. The reality is that by making this step, we are going to better prepare our students in the future. And we did a disservice, truly, in the past by having such low expectations. We were preparing our graduates. They were getting a diploma, but they were not always ready to move on to college without going into remedial courses or to go directly into the workplace. And the skills and the knowledge required to go in the workplace these days is not that much different from the skills and knowledge required to go on into our universities and colleges. But
Yes.
yes.
Is the object, overall object, to go to a bell curve, 6% proficient, 6% below?
In theory, these are what we call criterion reference tests, not normative tests. In theory, every student should be able to reach proficiency. The reality is when we score tests and scale them properly, there's almost always a bell curve. When I talk about value added in just a little while, we're going to see that the bell curve is alive and well in Tennessee in terms of that. But in our ultimate goal, and No Child Left Behind says every child is going to be proficient or advanced by 2014, but the reality is we continue to see that bell curve to this day. We have students who are well below grade level and those that are well advanced above grade level. That's 4th grade reading. If you look at 8th grade math, you see very similar patterns. The changes across the board were dramatic. In 2011, we only had 25% of our 8th graders in Tennessee reaching proficiency. And unlike previous years with TCAP, the numbers were not established to be consistent by grade level. Our math scores as a state go down from grade 3 to grade 4 all the way down to grade 8, fewer and fewer kids reaching proficiency. And there's a progression in mathematics. We build on the skills in earlier grades. So if you fall a little bit behind in those lower grades, it's going to get worse over time if we don't remediate. But you can see that we made a tremendous jump. Yes?
Just for clarification, isn't it true that most states in 2009, when that national test was given, most states had to realign their tests too?
It's true that there's a tremendous gap between the NAEP in almost all states. It varies considerably, but there were a few states that were relatively close to the national goals. The reality is that most states have not yet realigned. They tend to be in the process of realigning, and the current administration and the current U.S. Department of Education is pushing for higher standards. Tennessee, and I'm a lifelong Tennessean. I grew up in this state, and it's for the first time in my memory, we're really on the cutting edge in this state in terms of what we're doing with regard to raising standards, with regard to teacher evaluation. And it's going to be a little painful at times. We're out there, and when I go to national conferences now, there's a lot more interest in what we're doing than ever before. But most states have not taken the leap that we did. And honestly, as I alluded to earlier, I thought we would move in that direction. I was not expecting this kind of jump. Yes.
When will the next NAEP be given so that we have different standards, perhaps?
Well, we have, it will be given in certain grades. It actually was given in certain grades this past year, but this fall we'll start administering again, and we'll get new results probably sometime next year. We do expect to see movement toward the national assessment goals. So let's talk about No Child Left Behind and some of the requirements. And this is on the back of the one-page handout I gave you today. But there are a number of hurdles that schools have to clear. They have to read attendance targets and graduation targets. The attendance targets for elementary and middle schools is 93% of their students on an average day are there at school. The graduation rate target varies by school, but the eventual goal by 2014 is a 90% graduation rate, which is a big jump from where we were. We can't discourage students from taking the test, even if we think they're not going to do well on it. We've got a 95% participation rate target. If we don't hit that, it doesn't matter how well we do on the test. We don't make adequate yearly progress, or AYP. And then every subgroup must hit targets, either the same target as everyone else or make tremendous progress toward that target. And our subgroups are defined as all students who take the test. Everybody's in there in that all category. And when I say everybody, it's the students who've been there. The school's accountable for the students who've been there since the first 20-day attendance period. They've been there continuously all year long. But then we break our groups up by ethnicity. Our African American students, our white students, our Hispanic students, our Asian students, Native American students are all measured separately and held toward a target. Economically disadvantaged students, the students on free reduced lunch, students with disabilities, anyone receiving exceptional education or special ed services, and then our English learners or limited English proficient students. And I'll just mention, Metro Schools has the largest population of English learners by far in the state. This is the results from last year's high-stakes assessments in grades 3 through 8. I've actually given you 2 years of data since we changed to the new standards. The blue represents 2010, the red 2011, and you see the results by subgroup, and there are major differences between subgroups. The African American, Asian, Hispanic, white, economically disadvantaged. SWD, those are our students with disabilities, or our special ed students, and then limited English proficient, or LEP students. But you do see that we made improvement in Metro for each of those groups last year. And overall, there was about a 6% improvement, which for a district our size is pretty good. But now I'm going to add a couple of bars on here, a couple of straight lines that show where the targets were. In 2010, 20% proficient was the statewide target. In 1 year, it jumped all the way up to 40% because when we changed standards, we still were held accountable to getting to 100% by 2014. And instead of having targets that went up a few percentage points each year, now they're going up a tremendous target. And that's why the majority of schools in Tennessee are not making adequate yearly progress. That's why our governor and commissioner of education have said we need a new accountability system. This took us so far. It's done some very positive things like recognizing differences between subgroups, but it's kind of outlived its usefulness, and Tennessee's applied for a waiver. This is, which I'll talk about in just a minute. This is 3rd grade math. 3rd through 8th grade reading, language, arts. And you see we also made improvement for all subgroups here. But again, the bar in 1 year jumps tremendously. At the high school level, we saw tremendous progress, 12% improvement overall on our Algebra 1 or high school math exam. But you see where the bar went from 25% to 44%, and not all subgroups met that target. So again, even with that tremendous progress, we didn't make it. And finally, high school reading, language, arts. We were flat here. We didn't make growth, but this is where we also see the highest performance, 60% of students proficient in advance. As a result of No Child Left Behind, the district has failed 5 times since 2003 to make adequate yearly progress. We're in a pretty serious status, restructuring 1. Now, we haven't failed 5 consecutive years. you have to make it 2 years in a row to clear up your status to move to good standing. And we were on an even odd year tendency of making it in odd years, 2005, 2007, 2009, but not that other year, so we never cleared up our status. In 2008, we missed, in a district of 75,000 students at the time, we missed by about a half dozen English learners of making adequate yearly progress. It comes down sometimes to a very small number of students in one subgroup. And we have schools that sometimes miss by one student in a subgroup, but that's the system we have. The changes that are coming, Tennessee obviously got a lot of money under Race to the Top, $500 million over 4 years, and they set goals for every district in Tennessee. And theirs are a little simpler. They focused on third grade reading, and every system making a 4% improvement. We slightly exceeded that. They focus, third grade reading we know is a critical year. If the students aren't reading by third grade, they're going to be at a disadvantage going forward. 7th grade math, if we're going to be successful moving into the high school math courses, that's a critical year. They set a 5% district-wide improvement target for all students. We exceeded that 7.3%. Graduation rate target, and I'll go into this in just a minute a little more detail. They set a target of improving by 2.2%. We actually improved by almost 10%, but there were also changes in the way that was calculated, which I'll talk about. We think that the goals that are going to be set with the waiver that Tennessee's requested, which is due in a couple of weeks, are going to be an expansion of this system. And instead of focusing strictly on our subgroups, how are we doing overall in making improvement? In 4 to 5% a year for 75 to 80,000 students is pretty significant. We identify students, as I've mentioned, as below basic, proficient, or advanced. Below basic students are now being given grades on these tests that would correspond to essentially being an F student if you're below basic. The basic are D and C students, depending how far up the scale they are. Proficient students are B students, defined by the state. Advanced students are A students. This is real data from one of our middle schools where they were in 2011. To meet Race to the Top goals, they're going to have to improve in math. This is from math. They're going to have to improve by 5% a year. So that's a pretty consistent step. To do that, we can't just focus on the students who were barely short of proficiency this year. We've got to move all of our students up over time, because eventually our current low basic students are going to be borderline in 4 years for being proficient in advanced. So we're trying to push the idea that everyone's got to make steady growth. And our value-added system in this state is measuring the growth of all students on average. Graduation rate, we saw we met our goal. This 10% jump that we saw in 1 year really didn't occur in just 1 year. It occurred over multiple years. The state used to count double dropouts against us. In other words, if a student dropped out 1 year, came back to school, dropped out the next year, that second dropout was treated as if it were a second student, and that counted against us. And then they decided that's really not a fair approach, and they cleaned that up in 2009 and 10. So we probably had a deflated graduation rate prior to that. This graduation rate is based on an on-time graduation, 4 years for most students, 4 years in a summer to graduate, a 5th year for our students with disabilities and English learners. Now, the report card that's coming out this year was initially only going to report a 4-year graduation rate, but I understand that they're looking at both a 4 and 5 year. But it would be comparing apples to oranges if we don't get that 5th year. But the bottom line is we have made steady progress. We still have a lot of kids that we're not reaching, but it is getting better. One of the key components of Race to the Top is preparing students to be college and career ready. The ACT is the college entrance exam of choice in Tennessee. It's given to all of our high school juniors in Tennessee now. Every student before they finish high school should take it. The state pays for one exam. But you see the percent of students meeting their college readiness criteria. And by college readiness, we're talking about students who are prepared for success in those courses moving forward.
What score?
It varies by subject area, by subject, but basically it corresponds to what an average B student at college would get on this exam. And it's above a 19, I will tell you that, but it varies by subject, and I can't get the details. But the English cut is a little easier, a little lower for most, but you see that statewide only 15% of our students are meeting all of the requirements. So we know we have work to do here. Hopefully, by raising our academic standards, we will be addressing those needs better in the future. One thing I want to mention is that under the new criteria, we'll still have to focus on subgroups and narrowing the achievement gap. In 2010 in metro schools, we only had 17% of our African American students who were proficient or advanced, compared to 42% of white students. The state is going to assess all subgroups in comparison to ethnic groups comparison to the white students. So we had a 25% gap in 2010. Districts and schools are going to be required to reduce that by 10% a year. 10% of 25 is 2.5. So that means instead of a 25-point gap, we need to get that down to 22.5 the next year. The reality is our gap widened as a district. We went from 49, we went up for both subgroups, but we now have a 27% gap. So just raising achievement is not enough. We have to narrow that gap. And that's going to be one of the toughest challenges we have. It's very highly, the test scores are still very highly correlated to socioeconomic factors which underlie a lot of this. Our economically disadvantaged students are going to be compared to non-economically disadvantaged, our English learners to students who are native to this country. So we have challenges in terms of narrowing those gaps. And finally, I'm going to talk about academic progress or growth, because Tennessee is a value-added state. We're the first state to do what we call value-added, which is looking at progress over time. And you have some definitions on the back of your handout. Achievement is a snapshot on a given day or a given week at the end of the year. Did students meet certain benchmarks or criteria? It's a one-time snapshot. And that's how we report proficient or advanced status. But progress is following those students over time to see how they've made growth. And in Tennessee, we look at how an average fourth grade student, how a fourth grade student is doing in math compared to the average student in Tennessee in math. And are they making what we would call comparable growth? So by combining the two, we get a fuller picture of student performance. Where are they achieving on a given day, but are they moving in the right direction fast enough? I borrowed this from Battelle for Kids, one of the contractors Tennessee has under Race to the Top. Very simple example of measuring growth. We all have seen or been measured at some point against a wall, but you need a current year measure, and for us, 2011 TCAP is that current measure. Then you look a year before that, where were they in terms of height or in terms of achievement a year before, and that difference is what we're held accountable for. The new teacher evaluation system that's in the papers quite a bit these days, it's causing a bit of anxiety among our educators, is looking at 35% of the teacher evaluation now coming from this growth measure, this value-added measure. So if you're a fifth grade math teacher, the fourth grade math scores that student had were the baseline. How much progress do they make over that? That's what you're accountable for. We had the question earlier about the bell curve. When you take scores across the state of Tennessee, the number correct or the scale score that we convert that to statewide, it really does look like a bell curve. And we compute what we call statewide percentile scores on our kids. So you would look at a previous year. Say, if you're a fourth grade math teacher, look at where those students were in third grade the year before. among Tennessee students. As a fourth grade teacher, we're going to get a bell curve at the end of fourth grade, and your students are going to be compared in terms of their average their gain, which if you are making normal progress, a child who was around the 10th percentile last year is going to be the 10th percentile this year. If they're at the average or 50th percentile, that would be normal growth. But it's maintaining your ranking among Tennessee students. That's essentially what we're doing. We're ranking students from lowest to highest, and on average, are you maintaining that growth? And if you are, that's going to be an average score on the teacher evaluation. And principals are being evaluated based on the growth of all of the students in their schools in reading, math, science, and social studies. Holding educators accountable for test scores and student performance is a little controversial to some, but if we're going to do it, I'd much rather base it on growth than just looking at how well they did on a given day, because 75%, I can predict 75% of test score variation across schools just based on free reduced lunch statistics. That's how strong the correlations are. That's average growth. If your students are losing ground relative to other students, that's going to give you a negative number. That's going to lead to a lower score, a 1 or a 2 on that 5-point evaluation scale on average. And the goal is for students to move up in terms of their relative ranking. The best case scenario is you have both high growth and high gain. The worst case scenario, low achievement and low growth. Your kids are starting off behind and they're actually losing ground. In the past, we have schools that have had very high test scores, but perhaps it's because their students came in with much better background and opportunity, but they weren't making growth. And then we have schools that students are well behind. Parents may not have some of the advantages or education level, but they're making gains. And there's a lot of good things going on in those schools that's sometimes not recognized by just a one-time snapshot. So with that being said, and I'll just say that in Tennessee we made some nice improvement with regard to value added last year for the first time in a while, but the entire state took a hit in 2010 when we changed standards. So now I'm ready to open it up to questions. And Mark, any comments? Or?
No, thank you, Dr. Changus, and I know that was a lot to throw at everybody. Covered a lot of territory, but he does it so well. And now we got about 30 minutes for your questions, your comments, and I'll repeat your questions so that everybody can make sure that they hear the question, then we'll let Dr. Changus answer. Who wants to be first? Go right here.
Well, at what income level do students receive free lunch?
So what is the income level for a student that qualifies for free reduced lunch?
I don't have the exact figures, but I can tell you that we have over 70% of our students in Davidson County that qualify. But I don't have the exact figures. And I'll tell you that that's very protected information. Typically our teachers don't even know who their free reduced lunch students are. There are some who are receiving partial reduced price lunch, and there are some who are getting a completely free lunch, but I don't know that.
I can share with you a little bit. I don't know the exact number, but it's maybe higher than you might suspect. It's a different measure than the federal definition of poverty. So, for example, for a family or a child to qualify for the Head Start program, which is an early childhood program for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, that eligibility level, income level is very low. So it might be for a family of 4, $20,000 a year might qualify you for Head Start. In order to get free reduced lunch, a family of 4 metro schools might be able to make $40,000. So, I mean, I'm not saying that's enough for a family of 4 in today's economy in the high standard of living that we have in Nashville, but it's higher than a lot of people think. It's not the same thing as the definition of poverty. Yes, the front row here.
A previous lecturer that we had some time back on giving the history of the state, genealogy, and this type of thing, mentioned the fact that 40% of the citizens of Tennessee were illiterate for quite a while in the past history, where other states seem to be more progressive, North Carolina and the original colonies and all. And I just wonder if that's kind of reflecting on what.
So previous studies in Tennessee have found a high illiteracy rate. To what extent does that affect performance here?
Well, and the numbers are down a bit from there, but obviously, we have students every day that enter Metro schools from other countries that don't speak a word of English. They have 1 year, and obviously these tests, regardless of what subject you're testing, whether it's math, science, social studies, there's a very large language component. They have to read the test. We are allowed to read to a student, but they've still got to understand the language. But when you see numbers for No Child Left Behind, for limited English proficient students, they have 1 year that they're exempted from the reading test, and after that, they're tested, and we're held accountable for those. And 1 year is typically not enough to learn a language. The research shows 5 to 7 years is more typical. But it's a tremendous negative factor in terms of scores. I will also add, though, that those students who are learning the language typically show greater growth and progress. As they learn the language, obviously, they're going to do a lot better on the test. But yeah, a test is not valid if a person cannot read or cannot understand the language of the test. I couldn't go to many countries and do well in other languages. I've studied a few other languages, but not enough to ever reach proficiency.
I can share with you, the Chamber did a study on adult literacy a couple of years ago, and we looked at it from Nashville in our region. The percentage has fallen quite a bit over each sort of census, each 10-year cycle. So right now, I believe it's around 16% or 14% in Nashville, and that is the percentage of adults who have less than an 8th grade reading level. So that has dropped considerably over the years, but still, obviously, for those 14%, that's a huge challenge in today's workforce. Let's go to over here, yes.
A lot of the purpose of No Child Left Behind, I mean, the incentive to states is to get federal money. In other words, you're complying mainly for the purpose of obtaining, or not mainly, but one of the purposes, one of the incentives is to get federal money. Now, in the recession, we are reducing the amount of state money available for education. There's a likelihood in the future that there will be a reduction in the amount of federal money for education. So my bottom line question is there any correlation between the amount of money spent on a student, per student basis, and either progress or achievement? Is there
Okay, so states have to comply with No Child Left Behind because they get federal money. Those are the strings that make this whole system work. But to what extent is student achievement tied to resource or finances?
Yeah, that's a tough question because a lot of the federal money, if you try to tie it back to individual schools or students, the schools that are receiving those funds are the schools that are also the schools that tend to have the largest percent free reduced lunch, and parent education levels are lower. So typically correlations don't look very good. But you're also talking, if you just tie it back to raw test scores and not growth measures, the reality that we see is that the achievement gap, as I mentioned, has been one of the toughest things to reduce. And when you have schools that are 90% or higher poverty and high concentrations of poverty, those external programs or initiatives that we might put into our schools are typically not going to make a great difference. The greatest predictor of success in terms of student achievement comes down to teacher effectiveness and skills of the teacher. And in Dr. Register's approach, a lot of that is about building capacity. A lot of the money that we're putting into it is improving the skills of our teachers. One of the initiatives last year, middle school math, we saw scores of 25% students 8th grade Tennessee's proficient or advanced. Helping those middle school math teachers better understand the content they're teaching. They came on weekends to be instructed in math content themselves, because it's a tough area for us, math and science, to fill all of those slots with teachers who are effective in terms of student performance. So what I'm saying is that the dollars spent just on trying to raise scores for our most disadvantaged students are not typically going to be reflected in the test scores just in terms of raw scores. We tend to see growth where we use that money effectively, but it's how we use that money. So overall, it doesn't tend to correlate very well.
Do we have a question on this side of the room? I don't want to ignore the folks over here, way in the back. Yes.
College ready is a very deceptive term. In Western Europe, university like UT, a real university, only 10 or 15% go. Even places where the majority go to post-secondary, some kind of post-secondary training, but they don't call it university, they call it college, just meaning post-secondary. And if you're looking at everybody going to UT, and you think, I don't think those figures are bad.
Is that a comment or a question then, or?
Just because, why is that a standard when it's totally unrealistic?
So in this country, what does it mean to be college ready as opposed to other kinds of countries, and is that expectation inappropriate?
Well, that's a little bigger than I think I can tackle. I will say this, though. Whether that's a realistic expectation, we could probably debate for the rest of the morning. Whether it's realistic under No Child Left Behind to expect 100% of students to reach proficiency, I've got some strong feelings on that. I wish it were a reality. But as I also said earlier, we know that being ready for college and being ready for the workforce in this day and age with the technical equipment that's required, the manuals that you have to read to go into a lot of these jobs is not that different. Our goal is to prepare every student a little better toward reaching those goals. We may not hit those benchmarks, but any movement in that direction is positive. But we have set some pretty high standards on those entrance exams. I know that.
Let me just add to that, that when the chamber or other sort of elected officials talk about what it means to be college ready, I think right now you're increasingly seeing that being a broad definition. College ready, post-secondary includes 2-year degrees, 4-year degrees, technical certificates as well, because what we do find is that just about for any decent paying job in this economy, you're going to have some sort of training after high school. It may not be a 4-year degree, but it's going to have to be something. And so when people are starting to say college ready, they're kind of using that broadly. We find a lot of areas, so that might be. Let's go over here, yes.
I wanted you to explain a little bit about the transition to the end of course, how that's going to play out, the end of course exams.
So the transition in the high school tests, the end of course exams, what does that look like?
Well, we already have end of course tests that have been in place. Algebra 1, Algebra 2 now, English 1, English 2, English 3, first 3 years of English, Biology 1, U.S. History. These are tests of about 55 items that are given at the end of each course, at the end of the year, that students, it's a multiple choice exam, and it's again tied back to the standards for that subject. Now 55 items for an entire year is not a lot of items, so obviously there's a sample of a broader domain. Students, the standards that were also set by Tennessee educators. They brought teachers and principals and supervisors of instruction together to look at the content and say, what is our expectation of what a student in Tennessee should be able to do to be successful later on. They set bars for advanced, proficient, basic. Then they looked at other data, including NAEP data, including ACT scores, and other external criteria. And that was the big difference with the last standard setting, is that we didn't shy away from really moving the bar. But students are going to get a course grade based on that test, which is going to factor in now at 25% for that student as their final exam.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yes. I was wondering about is there a change in the graduation requirement?
No, let me say that up until a couple years ago, Tennessee had a graduation exam, gateway examination, that every student had to pass algebra, English, and biology requirements to get a regular diploma. That has gone away for the students currently enrolled. Now we have some students who did not get a regular diploma who were not grandfathered in, who are still coming back to take that exam. But there is not a single test now that's a graduation requirement. As I said, though, these tests will count as 25% of the course grade. The expectations at the high school level have gone up in terms of the credits, though, that are required, and that's particularly in mathematics, and that's the biggest change at the high school.
Do we have a question over here? Yes, we're in the middle.
Charged with construction of all these tests.
So who makes these tests?
The Tennessee Department of Education has the ultimate responsibility. And the State Board of Education grants approval of the standards that are set, but when I worked at the state, it was a joint process with us and an external vendor. There are several national assessment companies out there now. At one time there were a few. No Child Left Behind came along, and the market was there for other companies. But most of these national companies have a bank of items that they've used in other states. And the typical process is for our State Department people, along with educators, they'll bring in educators from different school districts to help review items, to ensure that they are aligned with our standards. But they have their own statisticians who help working with our educators to adjust where that bar is set. But the ultimate responsibility, again, comes down to the State Department of Education.
Do we have a question over here on the far end? Yes.
Do the institutions of higher education find any change in the number of remedial courses they have to offer?
So talk about the percentage or number of students, graduates that have to have remediation in college.
Well, I think it's a little too early to tell, but you'll see that nationally the numbers are pretty high. I think over a quarter of our kids at some point have had to take at least some type of remediation. But these standards just went in place 2 years ago, and we have not had our first class of graduates that have been exposed to 4 years under these standards. I hope within a couple of years we start to see some reduction.
Okay. Way in the back there, yes?
There seems to be a deficit in the knowledge of geography among high school graduates, and I'm noticing that that's not mentioned. Is that supposed to be included in history? I think geography should be included in things that are tested and worked on.
So we read news stories about how people don't know where continents are and geography, and to what extent does that get shortchanged in today's accountability system?
Well, I mentioned the unintended consequences of these tests, and the reality is that we do not hold schools accountable for geography. U.S. history is one of the end-of-course tests, but it's not even included as a high-stakes exam for schools. So outside of reading and math right now under No Child Left Behind, there are not high stakes for schools. So it comes down to individual teachers and their responsibility. And there's an internal battle there sometimes within a school in terms of the emphasis. But that's one area I'd like to see change, that we have a broader sampling that's part of this measure. It's hard to reduce everything education does to one number. And sometimes that's what's happened with these high-stakes tests. But I wish I had a good answer for you, but it's not addressed currently, and I don't see that happening in the immediate future.
We had a question here in the middle, yes.
Well, I've got a two-part question. First part is, I came this morning prepared to probably leave discouraged or depressed, because there's a lot of gloom and doom about this issue out amongst us. And yet, when I'm reminded of the diversity of the student body, the educational status of the parent, all those factors that are very challenging, I'm finding myself very confident that progress is being made by what I've heard this morning. Am I correct in that assumption?
I sure hope so. Now, let me say,
Well, just for the benefit of everybody, so are we really making progress, Paul?
Yeah, I'm encouraged. I'll say that. I came to Metro 13 years ago. I grew up in Knoxville. This community, this isn't going to happen just on the basis of Metro school educators. It's a community-wide effort. it's a very fertile area, that the community involvement, the universities, the expertise that's in this area. I've known Mark for a number of years in different roles, but I know the mayor's office and the chamber and so many people are on board. We have an alliance that supports us. We have Alignment Nashville, which involves our community organizations. It's going to take everybody to make the change, but the data is showing that we are moving in the right direction, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Well, that's the second part of my question. I'm a native Nashvilleian, and been fairly active in the community here and there, and I've never felt a time in this community where this issue has marshaled the following in support of that broad segment of the community that you talked about. So the second part of my question is, can we win on this thing?
We can win.
So as a community, can we lick this? Can we win? Can we be successful as a school system?
We can. Again, it's going to take time, and it's going to be small steps. I had opportunities when I left the state to go in some different directions. My father was, his father was an immigrant from Greece who settled in Nashville. My father grew up here for East Nashville High. I had some ties to Nashville, but this was a big move when I came here. One of the things that drew me, though, was the challenge that's here, and there's so many people who are devoted and dedicated to this issue, and I do believe we can make a difference. And I do think we're seeing signs of that. Also, and I know Dr. Register was here a couple of weeks ago. I'll just say, and this isn't because I work under Dr. Register, but I think we've got the right man at the top. I see so many things that are, the number of initiatives that are occurring in this district right now are overwhelming. And I can tell you that because part of my responsibility is to try to evaluate what's working and what's not, and it's hard to do when this much is happening at once. But he has brought in people from a national level to help guide this. He is tied in with the community that's here, and there are tremendous resources in this area. So I absolutely believe it's winnable.
I have a two-part question as well, and the first one is to the audience. Who has graduated from metro schools, from the school system here? A fair amount. I did as well in the 1980s. So part of my thinking, Paul, and this is a question for you, people talk about how we used to be good, metro schools used to be fine, now it's awful. But when I was in the 1980s metro schools, we had lots of people dropping out that nobody, number one, counted or cared about. And we never measured any of this stuff. So are we really that worse off?
I can't speak to your contribution at that time. I know that when you look at the poverty levels, when you look at the number of English learners, we have some challenges that are probably a little greater than that. But you're right in saying that we weren't held accountable for every student the way we are now. Graduation data was not very good to begin with, and it was skewed because we lost track of a lot of kids who dropped out. We weren't testing students the way we are now, every student. And I'll also mention too, when you look at our ACT scores, remember now every child, whether they're college bound or not, are being tested, and that wasn't the case. We used to have scores based on a small percentage of students, and it's really not apples to apples.
That's an important point to make. So when you look at different states and ACT averages, most states don't have every student taking that test. It's just that select few who know they're going to college, whereas Tennessee, every student takes a test. So it's really difficult to compare across states, but we can compare within the state across districts.
And if you look at SAT scores in Tennessee, which is the other major college exam, they look great as an average, but it's only our top 1 or 2% of students, so it's not a fair comparison.
Great. So another question way in the back there. Yes.
I know we're concerned about the poor achievers in the lower ranks of the scales here, but what are we doing in the public school system to challenge the exceptional students so that they can go on and produce what we expect of them?
Okay, so we focus a lot on getting low-performing students to proficiency, but what about pushing our high-achieving students? How are we doing there?
And I can only speak to some issues here, and I can tell you that the numbers of students taking advanced placement courses and baccalaureate courses has increased. from a measurement perspective, that is a concern of mine. When I said earlier we were doing a disservice by the low standards we set, it was impacting our highest achievers. And the data shows that the students coming in with the highest scores were not making the growth, and we're losing ground. One of the nice things about the new assessments and the new standards we've set, you saw what small percentages of students are reaching proficient status, advanced status. It's raised the bar significantly. But one of the key decisions now as a state we have to make with the new accountability system is to look at what are our new standards going to be going forward if we replace NCLB. And our department is having conversations with the state right now, and Dr. Register's already spoken to the commissioner. Let's not just look at what percent of kids are moving from basic to proficient, but what about from proficient to advanced? On the low end from below basic, all of those improvements are important. And if we're losing ground at the top and students are moving from advanced to proficient, that should count against us. So we're proposing a model, which I told Mark earlier we're hoping to submit today, which would look at all of those, because we don't want to just focus on a narrow band of students.
Great question. Let's go over here. Yes. Yes.
Working off that same question then, when you were describing that we really have to focus on the gap between the white people and all the other subgroups, or the alls and then the subgroups, it seems that that last one you showed where the whites went up too, and therefore the gap increased, that's a disincentive to be focusing on proficient and advanced because it only makes the problem bigger.
Yeah, let me repeat the question because
Yeah.
we're videotaping it as well. So the achievement gap, focusing on that, do we artificially hold the high performers at a certain level in order to narrow the gap, but we're not pushing those kids to even greater achievement?
I think that, first of all, that's a great question, and it's one that when I said we were submitting some ideas to the state, we've had that internal discussion. And Dr. Register is very concerned about the gap, but we believe that if all subgroups reach a standard that's maybe twice what the minimum expectation is, that we shouldn't be held accountable because one other subgroup exceeded their target. It's a constantly moving target. So while we would like to reduce the gap, we think it's more important that we get students in those disadvantaged subgroups paired, and that's where we've got to show the greatest growth. But let's not worry about the fact that we exceeded our target for another group.
This gentleman right here, yes.
I was wondering about the question of nutrition for families that are at risk for a variety of reasons. One, they want to shop in certain areas, there's no mass transportation. And these people have, they're working, they don't have time to deal with their children. So what can be done about the nutrition issue from K through, I don't know, some higher level that will be able to deal with the question of their performances in school?
Okay, so the comment is about...
How is that issue falling into what we're talking about now?
All right, so we know that students need nutrition, need to be fed, not hungry, in order to achieve, and we know that parts of our city are sort of called food deserts. They don't have access to grocery stores and that sort of thing. How does that issue impact achievement, and what might Metro Schools be doing about that?
Well, I mean, when I said this was a community-wide effort, this goes just beyond Metro Schools. We know that getting students who qualify for free reduced lunch signing up is one thing, but it's a bigger issue than that. And it's if students are worried about health issues and what's going on at home and whether they're hungry, all of these factors that negatively impact performance, it's going to limit our effectiveness with that child on that school day. So when I say that we have to reach out to the community, it's beyond just Metro Schools addressing that. And we don't have the funds to provide the transportation that might be needed outside of school time to address that. And when I say that this is a winnable battle, everybody in this community's got a part that they can help play in that. But there aren't any easy solutions for those things.
We had a question way in the back, and that gentleman, yes.
This is a question really to the chamber representative. We've seen how education, achievement, and progress builds upon
boy. So we know that performance is related to socioeconomic status, and to what extent does the Nashville Chamber look at those kind of indicators as it relates to education? I mean, we're focused on creating prosperity in an environment that encourages prosperity. So our indicators that we look at are obviously job growth, it's investment of private capital, it's also per capita income is a key issue. And what we find is that, and we are a regional chamber, we serve 10 counties, that it is often, there's often a pressure for families to move outside of Davidson County for a couple of reasons. One is cost of living. Sometimes they can get housing cheaper in the surrounding counties, but another huge issue is, frankly, the perceived quality of the public school system. And that is why, one of the reasons we are so focused on school improvement. We realize we don't have all the answers, we don't have the solution. At the end of the day, it is the job of the school system and teachers to make this happen, but what we try to do at the Chamber is focus on those critical areas where we can add value, where we can add support. In the area of high school reform, which I think we're going to talk about in next week or the week after, that is a big area that we're very involved in. We'll talk more about that. Did you want anything to that, Paul?
No, I'll just say though that that issue impacts our data. We're losing families, particularly at the middle school and sometimes high school level, that some of our highest achieving students. So that makes our challenge when we're trying to get these numbers up even greater. But it is a real challenge. That's why the advanced placement in baccalaureate courses and things we can do for our highest achieving is an effort to try to combat that, but we've got to do more.
Okay, last question there in the corner.
Actually, I have two of them. First of all, this is the third session I've sat through. All of the focus has been on third grade and up. The foundation is K-2. If you don't have a strong K-2 foundation, 3 through 12 fails. It's like building on a pile of sand, and you've got this large building going up, it's going to topple over. What are you doing to test the K through 2 students and embolden their program to ensure that they're more successful in 3 through 2?
Okay, so the state tests start in grade 3, but we know that an early start, early foundation is really important. What are we doing for K through 2 to help support that future improvement?
Yeah, first of all, a lot of standardized tests that we're talking about are not developmentally appropriate for younger students. So we have Devil's assessments, reading assessments, and more informal assessments that are given in the lower grades that are developmentally appropriate. But we don't have one assessment. For a while we were doing a screening of advanced assessment, but it was very basic readiness skills. At the second grade, we're doing an assessment in reading and math now, district assessment 3 times a year that's predictive of future success. It's through Discovery Education, but a lot of the early assessments are driven by teachers observing students, and we know it's a critical time. There just aren't a lot of good early childhood assessments that are out there.
I just want to follow up that this has been a pet issue of mine, and Paul knows this, for going running around this for years and years and years. And it's true. I mean, younger children are not going to fill out bubbles on a spreadsheet on that kind of high stakes test, but there ought to be some sort of assessment as they walk into the kindergarten door at the beginning of the year to assess where are they, and then let's get them on track. And my idea, the Chamber's idea, is that this ought to be a state sort of assessment, and we haven't yet seen state leadership on that topic.
Second question.
Okay, last one.
I can understand why your teachers are having a problem with the evaluations, that if their evaluation is based on 1 year's growth, they have to take kids from somebody else's class and make sure they grow a year. Have you ever thought about teaching in the, testing in the fall so that the teachers have some kind of a guideline to go by so they know where those kids are in the fall, so they can go ahead and start where the kids are and move them forward?
So if teachers are going to be evaluated on the growth of a student, why don't you test twice a year, once at the beginning of the year, once at the end of the year, and then you'll get a more accurate measurement of that teacher's effect.
Well, that issue has been raised at the state level. I think more than anything, it's a cost issue of additional testing. However, I will say our district is administering tests now in each of these grades. It's a high stakes test. in the fall with these discovery education assessments that we're giving. We're actually giving them within the first 3 weeks of the year, and then again in November, then again in March or April. They are predictive of the state exams about 85% of the time in terms of proficiency on those exams. They're highly correlated with those. But they also break the data down into very specific categories, how a child's doing in math concepts and applications and computation and skills that teachers can address. Teachers can use those tests, in fact, unlike the highly secure, high-stakes tests, to go down to individual items and see why a child got an item wrong. So we try to use that as our pre-test for the teacher's purpose.
All right, and that concludes today's program. Please join me in thanking Dr. Paul Chambers.